Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Alyssa Olenick. I was going to say Olnick, but luckily I asked her beforehand how to pronounce that, so we got it right there on that. So if you aren't familiar with Alyssa, she is a postdoc researcher studying metabolism and menopause, and she also has her PhD in exercise physiology, where she researched metabolism and exercise science in females. She's also a sports nutritionist, weightlifter, and ultra runner. So, Alyssa, really appreciate you taking time out of your day to hop on here and chat some fitness stuff
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hello, hello, you and everyone listening.
to me and everyone who's going to be listening. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to chatting with you. Like I talked about, we were out for a while now, so glad we were finally able to
hmm
get you to hop on. You're super busy, so yeah, looking forward to it. So I guess before we kind of dive into everything, if you want to kind of how I want to take this is just maybe a brief background, then I'd love to kind of chat about like what your current training looks like. So if you want to start with that, and then I'll kind of talk to you about your training and stuff like that.
Yeah, so for those that are unfamiliar with me, the long story short is I started playing sports and running and when I was growing up, and I said, man, I want to spend my whole life learning as much about this as I possibly can and share that with others. And by golly gosh, at 13, I made that declaration and here I am. So speed up through a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD, now a postdoc, all of the above, all the years doing research and science and all of that goodness along the way. I grew up doing cross country and track and lacrosse, played lacrosse in college for a little bit, left that early because I had the highest GPA and the lowest playing time and got really, really into just fitness recreationally, started lifting. I always ran a good bit, but I still kept running and I did a few weightlifting competitions, some Tough Mudders, got away from running for a few years, circled back, started running ultra marathons. And here I am today, sciencing, running my own business, and training for crazy ultra marathons while doing it all. So right now I am currently training for my first 100-mile ultra marathon. And I still lift a ton. I think we're going to talk about cardio today. So people aren't familiar with me. I always have to give the disclaimer of like, I'm not anti-lifting. I think when people see me as the pro cardio girl, I'll randomly get accused of being anti-lifting. And I'm like, I'm stronger and more muscular than most women, let alone runners. So I'm like very pro lifting, but I just I drank the Kool-Aid and the hybrid Kool-Aid far before it was cool and trendy. It was just known as strength and conditioning to me originally. But now it's like it's cool to be multi-dimensional in your fitness. So that's the Cliff Notes version of Doc Less.
Awesome. Yeah, no, appreciate you sharing that. So you knew at 13 that this is what you wanted to do. That's pretty young. I feel like a lot of people, they have an idea what they want to do, but then they completely change it. But you followed through and everything
Yeah.
like that.
It definitely, I went back and forth. At one point, I wanted to be an architect. Like I took like CAD classes in high school because that's what normal high school girls do. And, I also almost went to school for business and marketing, which is hilarious because that's what I kind of do now on the side. And it was a kind of a last minute change of colleges because my scholarship fell through because the coach got fired at the school that I was going to. And it was like a whole mess of things. And so I changed my college and my major with 6 weeks before moving to college. And I told my mom, yeah, let's do pre-professional health science. I wanted to pivot to exercise science at the college I was going to go to, but my parents were like, hey, like these lab fees and extra cost for being a science major is really expensive. And, you don't have the context of student loans at that time, but it was a kind of blessing in disguise pivot. But I went into freshman year of college and I was like, I'm going to be an exercise physiologist. And I viewed that as like being an elite Nike trainer,
Yep.
not being like an industry knowledge expert leader. I didn't even know that those were even open possibilities for me. I just knew I really liked exercise. I really liked sport. And I always really just followed that passion. And I really wanted to share that gift with others. And that was always kind of like my big driver. And then I kind of found out I was good at science by accident. And then here we are. So yeah, it was kind of like this, zigzag path, like anyone in their early years. But I really did go into college like pretty clear on like, okay, exercise.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome. So you researched metabolism and exercise science in females specifically. Was there anything like that you researched particular or like with that? Yeah. When you were there, like was there any like papers that you did or anything like that specifically or
Yeah, so I have I want to say like 15 scientific publications and a bajillion presentations, and I'm working on probably 5 different papers right now at the moment. So yeah, I have some published stuff in metabolism, postprandial metabolism, exercise metabolism, some menstrual cycle stuff, sex comparison stuff. I'm working on some menopause papers right now. And so yeah, I got lucky. I got kind of thrown into the female phys and metabolism stuff in my master's, and I brought that into my PhD. And so I've pretty much always been in the areas of metabolism. exercise science undergrad degree stuff. I did like it was funny. My like little undergrad project was on heart rate variability of a
Mm.
new heart rate monitor when photoplethysmography or wrist stuff first came out versus EKG in trail runners. So that was foreshadowing, I guess, of what I'm doing now, being the trail runner heart rate girly. In the kind of the online space. But yeah, most of my master's stuff and PhD stuff was largely, I've always done stuff in women. And then I've always looked at either how we respond to the food that we eat or how our metabolism responds to exercise is kind of like the path that I've always been on.
Awesome. What's been like your like favorite kind of paper to do? Yeah, with that.
So I'm biased that my dissertation, and that's my baby. I mean, I worked so hard on that and I got really lucky. And it doesn't sound luck to a lot of people, but I had an underfunded PhD. My lab didn't have a ton of funding, but with that, my advisor allowed us to have a lot of creativity and freedom. And so I really got to come up with my projects and topics on my own volition and came to him with ideas based off reading and rationalizing it. And so, it was a two-part thing where I did a sex comparison in the first one and then menstrual cycle and birth control in the second one. But I kind of created a protocol of, testing something called metabolic flexibility during exercise using high intensity interval training. Because normally we test or quantify metabolic flexibility as how you respond to foods that you eat, and your body can like shift between carb and fat appropriately to like store things or burn things or upregulate metabolism rather than just having it like essentially pool in the bloodstream. And that's what long term can lead to or is related to things like, insulin sensitivity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic disease, stress in the vascular system. We don't really want that. You want to have a healthy metabolic response. But, I think that exercise as a measure of health and fitness is very underrated. Like your ability to oxidize substrate appropriately during exercise, which is a fancy scientific way of saying you can use carbs and fats appropriately, having a high ceiling of fat oxidation is related to high fitness status, and people's fitness status, specifically cardiovascular fitness status, also is strongly related to how you respond to the food that you eat and your metabolism across the day. So I was like, why are we not capturing this? Because I think that like people don't recognize that your fitness status is a measure of health. And I don't think we appropriately talk about that enough in the industry. And so my studies really showed that when it came down to either the sex differences or even the menstrual cycle or birth control, that fitness status mattered the most, especially in females, which fits my bias of a lot of things. But it's like, hey, we need to be more aerobically fit if we want to be more metabolically healthy. And that aligns with like every single paper that I did in my PhD showed that the fitter group had a healthier response to either the meals that they ate or the exercise protocol. And so that kind of fits in with my bias of a lot of things. Like, yes, body composition plays a role in these things as well, but aerobic and cardiovascular fitness status, I mean, that's a reflection of your underlying metabolic energy systems. And so that's kind of been fun for me. And then, I'm really excited about my postdoc stuff now. That's kind of chugging along slowly but surely. So nothing's out on that yet. So hoping to dive into that data and having that out later this year. And I don't know how much I can kind of disclose about those things. So we'll keep it at that.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you kind of what you were working on now and what you guys were looking at from a menopause perspective. I feel like that's definitely like a age group or period of time in life that it seems like there's a lot more research coming out, especially from like an exercise standpoint.
Yeah, I'm working on all those papers, so I don't have like a ton of conclusive stuff to say to that.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at things like age and weight status during the onset of menopause, and then some stuff with cortisol. So everyone will soon become a
Cortisol.
cortisol girly here soon. But some cool data. I just don't have any.
Yeah.
I'm blinded to some stuff, or I'm waiting for the statistical analysis on other things. So I really don't have anything super exciting to share on that yet. But hopefully, science is slow. I know people will be like, can you send me your papers? And I'm like, give me 2 years and then I'll
Yeah.
have them because science is slow. But I'm excited to finally get some of those moving forward and out the door.
Awesome. Yeah, no, anytime I have somebody that's like involved with the research, I always come away like amazed at like, all right, I always have so much respect for like how long it takes and just like how much just how much stuff goes into it and how long it takes and everything like that. I don't think people
People have
realize that.
no idea. I get really defensive and annoyed when people like kind of shit on the state of female physiology because yes, I agree it needs improvement, but it's like kind of insulting to the people who really are boots on the ground trying to do this work and how much work it takes and how hard it is. And it's like let's support the people doing the work as it is.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, we want it to be better, but it's not going to be better if you just keep dunking on us every single time you're unhappy with the state of the industry. Like exercise science and sports science has its problems, but this work is being done by some incredible, incredible people, and it does just take time. And I think that the lay public, I understand the frustration of wanting more data sooner, faster, but science is a deliberate, intentional slow, and underfunded process.
Underfunded. Yep. I feel like especially in exercise science too.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, you're really involved with like female research and stuff like that. Where's kind of the state of the union at with that right now? Like, is it getting better? Because I know that that's like something that people kind of always say is like, oh, there's female representation is just always low when it comes to exercise science and stuff like that. Is that something that you feel like is getting better? Where are we kind of out there with that?
Yeah, so I always find it funny when people try to like pull the thing on me when I'm talking about this stuff and saying like cycle syncing isn't necessary or kind of debunking things. They're like, well, women are underrepresented, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm the second author on the study Invisible Sportswomen, where we pulled up the data for 5 years in the top 5 journals and looked at that. And so, what we found that was published like 2 years ago now. So I'm sure it's potentially not even, it might be getting better, but we published it as a follow-up to a study that was done in the 5 years prior to that. And the rates and statistics of female specific studies or female total participants really wasn't that much different, but hopefully it's getting better. So we found like 6% of sports science studies, at least in the top 5 journals, were done only or exclusively on female only topics. And then about 32 or 34% of the total participants were females. And I do think there's a big push for this now. There's more funding opportunities. Journals are asking like, hey, if you didn't include women, rationalize why you didn't include them in this population or this study. Like, did this study ask something that couldn't be done on both males and females? There's a bigger push for this now, more awareness. I think honestly, as much as it's annoying, the trendiness and the popularity of the demand on the female phys front for menopause, peri, menstrual cycle, even pregnancy, I think that does trickle into academia and researchers doing questions. So we worked on part 2 of that paper, and we found that most of the work that is being done of higher quality in these top 5 journals, we like scored the quality based off the methodology that you should consider when studying females. I won't bore you guys with those details. And then we found essentially that female-led or female editorial board-led journals had higher quality of papers or better papers being done based off like methodology that we would consider. Because one of the biggest issues with female phys is like the incongruency comes from the fact there is papers out there. I think people act like, oh, there's no data. There is data. It's just like, it's not as robust as other things, or it's underdeveloped, or it's really messy because the methodology isn't well done, or it's incongruent. And so we found, okay, well, females are mostly leading and doing this work, but females are leaving academia and sports science more frequently than their male colleagues for a myriad of reasons. And so right now we just started doing the interview process for part 3 of seeing like, okay, well, why are these female researchers leaving academia and sports science? Or if they're staying, what kind of resistance are they feeling? And like, because at the end of the day, we want this work to happen, but you need scientists and people who are trained and staying in the field to do this. And so we're trying to kind of like not just sit around and be like, which I think is unproductive when people are like, there's no research, and they just like kick and scream about it. I'm like, okay, well, like, what are you doing to support that, other than just kicking and screaming? Because like we're trying to actually improve the state of this or figure out what's going on or like where we can kind of start and work in and supporting all of these things. That kind of comes back to like when people are like trying to dunk on the researchers doing this stuff. And I'm like, we're the ones doing the work that you guys are wanting. Like, you got to be like, we're on your side. Like, we are not against you kind of thing. So I think it's getting better slowly but surely. I think there's a lot of amazing groups like Faster coming out of California, or there's the female group WUSI about Boston's Children, led by Katie Ackerman. I mean, there's amazing researchers like Abby Smith Ryan and her lab. My friend Sam doing that. I have my friend Kelly, who's also part of the Invisible Sportswoman thing. Like, and then there's just like Stu Phillips is collaborated now with a few other big researchers, and they're doing all these reviews and meta. So I think there's more stuff coming out and more of a push for this, slowly but surely. But it's just going to take time, because the biggest thing with female research is it's more obstacles, more steps. It costs more money. People don't want to do it because of these things. So we need to be supporting the people doing this. But we did have a few clinical trials that were recently submitted, like 1 or 2 of them, I think, specifically trying to like look at like kind of like, okay, cycle sync or E-type specific stuff, and like really looking at that, because that's where we're really lacking at this point in time. And then like obviously the menopause stuff is wide open, and hopefully over the next few years that will continue to keep getting filled as there's more demand for it. So
Awesome. Yeah. Where do you kind of sit at currently with the cycle syncing at this point, like with like the workouts and yeah, and everything like that?
yeah, so I mean, I'm like become known as the anti-cycle sync girl, and I think that people think that means that I'm like anti, oh, there's nothing different between males and females, we're exactly the same. I'm ignoring people's individual. And that's not the thing. There's like three camps, right? There's a camp who's like, oh, we need to sync our entire life around our menstrual cycle phases, and you need to do specific workouts and specific days of the week at specific time. And then there's over here of the people who are like, there's absolutely no difference. It's all made up. And I'm kind of in the middle of this nuance. It's like, well, there's some stuff that's probably affected or impacted, and it's also probably very individual. And I do think the menstrual cycle has real impacts on people, whether it's physiological, psychological, or just perceptual. I don't even know if perceptual is a word, but you know what I mean by people's perception. Also, there might be things. I don't think it's as black and white as we are exactly like males. I think that's silly to say because there are some sex differences. I think that people conflate sex differences and menstrual cycle differences, though. They think that, okay, well, we are different from males. That is true, right? We have some different underlying physiology that impacts certain things, but that's not the same as like the menstrual cycle stuff. And that's just messy and it's not super clear. And there are some patterns, but there's nothing at this time. Even if we want to critique or criticize methodology or congruency across the research, I'm of the belief that if there was this big, clear, established, robust pattern, we would see that coming up. And we do see some things. And there's some stuff that I'm okay with saying, I think there is something to the potentially, maybe we do have more muscle development potential in when estrogen is high in the follicular phase, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't still lift in the luteal phase. You know what I mean? Like that's where people get confused. It's like, you don't need to take this like one size fits all 28-day approach of like, you should only lift this week, only do power and hit this week, only do cardio this week, only do Pilates, yoga, walking this week. I think that that's one, it assumes everyone has the same cycle and they don't. Everyone does not have a 28-day cycle of exactly the same timing of ovulation, or the length of the follicular phase is variable person to person. Not everyone's luteal phase is the end of the world to them, and it's not like totally impacting their training. Not everyone feels best in the follicular phase. Some people feel terrible around ovulation. Like it ignores all this individual variety within it. And so the best recommendations at this time is, yes, there's some things that might happen or you can consider, but it's tracking and establishing your own cycle pattern, tracking and establishing your own symptomology, then using, I think, nutrition, behavior, sleep, support as a way to improve or reduce some of the symptomology. Then maybe we are individually on an individual level adjusting training in some way or another. Like people think I'm anti-adjusting your training to things. I'm like, no, but that just doesn't mean like there's not a single piece of data that says you should only do certain things at certain time of the month. It's coming from like this hormone crowd, and it's this over extrapolation of hypothesis of how hormones and exercise interact. And what I'm finding a lot of the time is it's well-intended people who are more functional, nutrition, hormone, blah, 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 qualified or not, usually not, where they're over extrapolating what they think is going to interact with hormones in the cycle, but they have no training on exercise programming or managing fatigue or stress or intensity in volume within training. So they just paint everything as bad except for like Pilates, yoga, and walking for like half the month. And so, I'm of the stance of like, you don't need to be doing a different program every single week of the month. And you surely shouldn't only be doing low intensity exercise 7 to 10 days out of entire month, right? And everyone's cycle month to month and person to person is going to be different. So learning the tools to manage your symptoms, knowing how to adjust your training and your programming, learning to manage, adjusting volume or intensity as needed to adjust for those things is going to be more of a beneficial skill. Auto-regulation really at the end of the day, instead of this. And I think the reason it's gained so much popularity is because there's just been this push from the fitness industry for years, for women specifically, push, 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 hard, 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 intense, 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 burn fat, be skinny, overdo it. And so we're conflating all exercise with that instead of saying, hey, no, you know what actually women need? They need good training programs. They need good training programs. They are not marketed that. They are not sold that. They often are overdoing it or overexerting or over pushing or not learning how to listen to their bodies. I'm all for that. But listening to your body doesn't mean falling below the exercise guidelines for 1 to 2 weeks every month. And every time I say this, people are like, you're putting words in people's mouth. That's not exactly what it is. But every single variation of cycle syncing you see is different. None of them are consistent. They give different prescriptions for different phases because it's all made up. So it's far better to take what we know from the data and science, because guess what? Females adapt to exercise training with progressive overload over time. It's not like we have studies that show with training interventions, with males and females, that they still adapt and respond. And they also adapt to the same capacity as males. We gain just as much relative muscle and strength. We're not that much different pound for pound in our overall strength and body weight. There's going to be a little bit more power and a little bit, that muscle fiber breakdown with those things, but we adapt. And we also adapt to cardiovascular training over time. Like, it's not like as if we don't adapt to these things with chronic training. And if we find some refinement over time with like, oh, it might be better to push this volume here during the cycle, I'm all for that. People think I'm against that, but that's not necessarily cycle syncing and what it's being marketed as. That would be like strategic manipulation of training variables in response to the training cycle, which we don't just have the data for. We have very preliminary early data that it might be better for muscle gain to lift when your estrogen is high in the follicular phase. But if you use autoregulation and you adjust your programming appropriately, like if you feel better during that phase, you're probably moving more weight, so you're probably moving more volume, so you're probably getting your bang for your buck. And similarly, if you feel crummier in the luteal phase, you're not recovering. Well, if you use autoregulation and you pull back either volume or your RPE automatically adjusts your weight, guess what? That's decreasing volume and that's making it more recoverable. Like these things account for that, other than some maybe potential strategies with food or sleep or behavior that can support some of the symptomology for people. Because yeah, the menstrual cycle does, people report that it impacts their training. And some of the most interesting data, this is me now tangenting, is that some of this is starting to, there's some data that suggests that it's psychological more than it's physiological. And I think that's why the data is so messy for people, because they're like, I feel this is real, this is hard, I feel like crap. But what we're seeing is that potentially the changes in hormones, specifically that dropping and plummeting of hormones at the late luteal phase and early PMS, which also coincides with the greatest symptomology in general, potentially you're having lower serotonin and you're having increased pain perception. And so RPE feels like it's greater. And you also potentially feel like you're not as strong or you're not as fast, and you feel more negative, both from a mood standpoint, but a pain perception standpoint. And there might be some less neuromuscular efficiency there potentially that we're seeing with that, because we do see trends that parallel this with performance being impacted in that late luteal or early menstrual phase. So when people like try to do those reels where they're like, gotcha, my strength was worse this week, we're like, yeah, like the data, that's kind of like a common theme in the data. Like nobody's denying that, but is that coming from a physiological impairment or is that coming from a psychological and perceptual thing? And I think that's interesting. That's coming out of the data. And that doesn't mean that your perception or what you're perceiving from like a psychological standpoint isn't valid. That is still valid, but it just means that like your muscle, like capacity might not be changing, but that doesn't mean your performance isn't impacted by other things. But how can we manage or mitigate those or recognize that without just like foregoing all training, or so you can, work with your body and your symptoms and all that stuff, because it isn't invalid. Period pain is very real for many people. Some people have more extreme versions of PMS. They have PMDD, they have endometriosis. Like this isn't to say that those conditions, it's just like, hey, no, you should train every single day for the rest of the month, ignore your pain symptomology. It's, hey, your experience is different, and it might be different every single month of your life or in different phases or months of your life, or person to person. Like I get a lot of feedback from people of like, hey, my experience with my cycle before and after having kids was completely different. And I had to really totally learn how to readapt. But those skills will also help not only through like those hormonal changes with pregnancy and postpartum, but also when we get into like perimenopause and menopause, if we train females across their life how to work with symptomology and fatigue management and this stuff, when they get to perimenopause and things get really, really haywire for them, and their cycles are all over the place and super chaotic, well, guess what? You have the tools to adjust and ride the waves rather than this on off that we're kind of training people to do. And really, it's just under training females. It's giving them poor exercise training and guidance. They already fall below the exercise guidelines. They already are potentially, undertrained in many ways when it comes to strength and muscular and bone density, which we want as we age gracefully, or even cardiovascular fitness. Because now we're seeing the trend as the hyperswing with cycle syncing is like this demonization of cardio, and like we're repackaging weightlifting as if it's like a female specific thing. It's just like this is just a pinkified version of what we've already been telling you to do. And so I worry about it from a long-term health standpoint, especially this generation going then and through perimenopause and menopause. Is like, are we just setting ourselves up for like further failure because we're so afraid of hormones in light of exercise performance? And I think if we can get a better marriage between actual good exercise programming, strength and conditioning type logic stuff to the female nation population, and not just 5 days a week of burn boot camp, we could be doing a lot more. We would see a lot more of these complaints about feeling overexerted or burnout or undernourished or having hormonal dysregularities because of our relationship with exercise. That would be alleviated a lot with good exercise programming and nutritional knowledge, rather than this cliche solution to the fitness industry's idea of like push, 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 starve, 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 fat loss, fat loss, fat loss. Like, yes, that's going to lead to hormonal dysregulation. And people are finding, improvements with this because of cycle syncing, because they're just lowering volume intensity and getting back below a threshold of energy availability that they need to be at. rather than this itself being a solution to the problem. So that's a really like roundabout way of going about like this discussion, because there's multiple angles to this. But to conclude, I think cycle syncing, at least in the industry standard one size fits all 28-day Pinterest meme version of it, TikTok popularity is hot flaming garbage.
I love it. That's the hot take there. Yeah. So
That's
so it sounds like though again you're not like saying like you might not need to adjust anything. It's just don't fall into that trap of like, oh hey, don't weight train at all or like completely omit like exercise during that period of time. Like feel it out, auto regulate, and make those adjustments there. And then the cool thing with that is you're also going to kind of develop that skill in terms of how to do that long term as well. Because like then you said, as you age, you get into that menopause stage, you're probably going to have to rely on that a bit more as well too when you get into that stage. Just your hormones really get out of whack, and it's probably more up and down during that time.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I just think if we just start training females a little bit more like we're training the bros in this world, we would actually improve a lot of these things, which is contrary to what people want me to say. Saying train females more like males, that sounds problematic to a lot of people, but it actually, if you bring coaching compassion alongside that skill set, I think it improves fitness, health, and understanding across the board. We're not the same as your male clients, but you don't need to pinkify the programming.
So like what would be some of those like adjustments that you feel like, and you may have hit on it throughout, but like is it from like a volume standpoint? Is it just like you said, just training more for like progressive overload? Is it not always like trying to fat loss? I know you kind of hit on those things, but are those kind of the main things there that you see that?
Yeah. I think that there's a few key mistakes I see a lot of, women making, and not everyone's making these. And so it's not to say that like, oh, you're already following a progressive overload linear program, all your menstrual cycle pains and symptoms will go away. Not necessarily, but you got to start with finding congruency in your training program. Like you can't figure out how your cycle's impacting your training unless you're one following a consistent training program, because how are you going to know how that's impacting variables in your training? And then two, you don't even know where you're at in your cycle. Like it's easy to say, do this on week 1, this on week 2, but like how many women actually know when they're ovulating or when their luteal phase starts and end or when their period's coming? Like some do, but I do recommend like following those trends and knowing that. But if you're not following a consistent programming, you're just doing random things all the time, you might not really actually realize or know, oh, okay, this week, this does seem to impact this. Or I really have a hard time recovering at this point in time. So like follow this consistent programming enough. Like I'm not saying everyone has to be a robotic bodybuilder, but have some linearity in what I think a lot of women are frustrated they're not making progress because they're doing random haphazard things all the time. They're not doing anything consistent. There's a lot of variability, and it's not even like structured variability, right? Like some CrossFit type programming is structured variability, and I'm okay with that. I'm not against that. Like there is some consistency and redundancy with that variation. But we're talking like doing very random things all the time, or you're only doing like, this group fitness, high and moderate intensity thing all the time. And then you're like, oh, I'm not getting progress. I'm not getting results. Well, it's not that you can't do those things, but maybe we're then pulling back doing that 5-6 days a week, which I think a lot of those things aren't even designed to be done that often, but people are doing them that often, and doing like 2 or 3 structured like progressive, consistent lifting days that are designed to be higher intensity, higher quality, developing muscle and strength. Like that's really important. And you're not often getting those in those types of classes. Again, it depends on the structure and the class and the programming, what you're doing. And so, pulling back some of that, or we're not doing moderate to high intensity cardio every single day. We're dividing up. Some days are more high intensity, more intentionally harder. Some days are easier. And so I think what happens is a lot of women, they just do this like moderate intensity continuous circus training or random stuff all the time, or they're only doing like Pilates and yoga, and they're not doing things of any intensity. Like it's usually one or the other. It's like you're not doing enough intensity to get the gains or progress or results that you're looking for, or you're doing so much intensity that it's no longer high intensity, or it just everything becomes like this moderate stimulus kind of thing, rather than like specific to strength, specific to cardio, specific to when it's high intensity. And I think a lot of that gets solved by like having more of a developed training program. And again, this isn't to say you have to give up your group fitness classes entirely. You can never do them again. They just have to be part of a greater progressive system of what you're doing if you want specific results. If you're just exercising and moving for the sake of it, keep doing that. It doesn't matter. Meet the exercise guidelines, keep it going with your life. But if you care more about these specific things, or you feel wrecked, fatigued, under recovered, terrible, then we need to be looking at that training. Or I think the most important thing to address before the cycle syncing, before all of this stuff, is what are you eating? How much are you eating? Low energy availability is like the number one thing. I think everyone's obsessed with cycle syncing, but like low energy availability and nutrition in females is like the most important and key thing that we should be looking at, that leads to way more stress in the body, way more elevated cortisol, way more dysregulation in hormones. And that doesn't even have to be like broad scale, long-term, like calorie restriction. It can be within the day. If you're living off an iced coffee and a whiff of air every day until lunch, guess what? You're in low energy availability. If you're not eating enough carbohydrates to match the demands of the activity you're doing, so if you're doing 5-6 days a week of moderate to high intense boot camp type classes, but you're restricting your food intake or carbs, guess what? You're in low energy availability. Guess what? That's more stressful in your body. Guess what? That is higher cortisol response. Guess what? That is potentially dysregulating your hormones. So it's like this mismatch of knowledge of fueling for what you're doing is super, super prevalent. Even in people who are like, well, I overeat or I'm overweight. So I'm overeating. But if you're doing this, like I undereat all day and then I overeat at night or on the weekends thing, you're still kind of in these acute periods of low energy availability. Like fueling appropriately means eating enough. That doesn't always mean eating too much or more. I know that's like, counter to say, people don't like that take, but like even overeating all the time is, negative for its own reasons or ways. But you also want to be eating regularly and consistently, and we're more sensitive to these energy deficits. And so everyone's obsessed with cycle syncing from a hormonal dysregulation point, and they're pointing the fingers at exercise. But it's really this under eating, especially carbohydrate, to, support the activity demands that we're doing, matched with potentially, yeah, we might be overdoing it on this, like, what we're doing every single day and not, spreading out the volume or mode or intensity more appropriately across the week so that it's recoverable and adaptable and specific to what we're trying to do. Again, if you just are working out to work out, sometimes you might be overdoing it still and you might need to pull it back, but you can keep doing the things that you're doing. Maybe you don't need 6 days of CrossFit because CrossFit wasn't designed to be 6 days in a row. It was designed to be 3 days on, 1 day off, or even Orange Theory. These are the ones people talk about. Their class model isn't even to be doing that 6 days in a row. Like they say do 2 or 3 days and then take a day off. Like it's not supposed to be that way. So like really auditing that. And then when you have this, like I'm eating enough, I'm fueling enough, I'm sleeping enough, I have a consistent training routine, then it's like, okay, well, now you kind of can track your cycle and see how that's impacting things and then figure out how you might best need to support your body and what you're going through. And that might look different than every single other person out there. And I think there are some commonalities. Then that's why the cycle syncing stuff has resonated with, because there's enough people that it resonates with, but there's also a lot of people who that doesn't resonate with, but they're kind of like brushed under the rug, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So again, it kind of sounds like, people will kind of look at that cycle syncing thing, but then like they're overlooking like the fact that they're under eating, they're not feeling enough. And it's like, hey, we need to get that, we need to focus on that first, kind of see where you're at, and then, potentially make those adjustments and auto regulate from there. Is kind of what it sounds like there with that.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean you have to ignore your cycle. You have to wait 3 to 6 months to start tracking and adjusting if that's a barrier for getting exercise in with your client or yourself. But it doesn't mean don't overhaul your entire life to fit some one size fits all protocol if you don't even know if it fits you, right? Like,
well, yeah. And two, probably, if you are, in that low energy availability state, and then like I'm sure that's going to impact your your cycle even more, probably, right? Like some of those symptoms could potentially be worse.
That's what leads to like loss of ovulation and like luteal phase deficiency or short or prolonged cycles, depending on the person, and downregulates hormones. And it's like, I joke, I think I have a real once, and it's like all of your favorite cycle syncing coaches just had low energy availability. And like and then they're projecting that onto everyone, which don't get me wrong. There are a lot of women who are overdoing the cardio and under eating and are stressed out the wazoo. I don't disagree with that, but I don't think the solution is cycle syncing. I think that we're putting a Band-Aid on something when we're not actually addressing, like it's like an overcorrection, I think, to the things that we can do to both support health, fitness, and longevity, but also hormonal health. Like, I don't think these two things have to be counter. And I think that sometimes it gets painted as like, okay, the performance girlies or at war with the cycle girlies. And it's like, well, not everyone's this delicate butterfly who can only handle 2 weeks of intensity every single month. We just have to learn how to program better, because elite athletes, like, they're not cycle syncing and they're making progress and moving forward, but they also have high prevalence of low energy availability and hormonal dysregulation. And that's coming from a lot of the time restriction, right? They're adapted to their training and what they're doing, but they're restricting their food intake. So we have to like think about what's the actual problem at hand here.
Yep, getting to the root cause of it versus like you said, putting that Band-Aid on it there with that. Cool. Yeah, I think that was something that we were going to potentially touch on, but I felt like that was a good time to chat about it. So I do want to kind of touch base on cardio, because I know you kind of mentioned this initially. You're like, hey, people kind of paint me as anti-lifting. I'm all about cardio. And so I kind of wanted to just kind of tie in how, for you, like you obviously have a ton of background on cardio. So I think, I guess we'll kind of switch there, because a lot of people that listen to this, do lift weights, but I definitely think the part where they probably struggle with the most is incorporating some cardio. So I'd love to touch on that. What would be some benefits of somebody adding in, some cardio to their routine, and everything like that? And then maybe also hit on like some misconceptions around it, like where people make some mistakes, with adding in cardio and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I'm going to ruffle the feathers of every bodybuilder person I feel like is more
I
your
love
niche
it.
here. Your walking isn't enough.
I love
Doesn't
it.
mean it's a bad place to start. And for sedentary people or low activity people or very deconditioned people, it very well may be where you're starting, which is absolutely fine. But that shouldn't be the end goal, right? I think the bodybuilding and fitness in the hormone girlies, the one thing they all have in common is they think lifting and walking only is all you need for health and fitness. And muscle is important as we age. Muscle and bone strength and overall strength and type 2 muscle fiber development. Yes, these are all absolutely vital to healthy aging and longevity, but it's completely ignoring the fact that your VO2 max is heavily related to long-term mortality, which is a fancy way of saying death rate to disease. When we're looking at studies and things like that, like having a higher aerobic fitness and VO2 max, this isn't to say like if we got to pick one or the other, it's not one or the other. It's both. Like I'm not of the camp of like, oh, is it one or the other? Like we absolutely don't want to just be frail endurance athletes as we age. But, aerobic fitness is almost more heavily tied to longevity and long-term health outcomes and metabolic health as we age than lifting, or at least lifting on its own. Like when we look at everything, it's like, what's the most beneficial for metabolic health or body composition or all the stuff. And it's like, it's both. Every single time the industry keeps trying to paint this either or type thing or make it seem like, you just need muscle and walking. And that's great baseline for most people. But I would love to see people doing things that are intentionally and specifically developing their aerobic fitness, improving their VO2 max, and training the characteristics of your muscles that are specific and unique to endurance and aerobic training. I think people think of cardiovascular training as just elevating your heart rate or breathing heavier. And it's not just that. I mean, you can get stressed and that elevates that stuff, right? Like lifting with a high heart rate isn't cardio. It doesn't mean that there's not overlapping benefit. Like your cardiovascular system does have a benefit from lifting. You're still putting strain on that, but it's not the same. And the stimulus in the pathways that are triggered from lifting and endurance training or cardiovascular training are completely different in the muscle cell. It's not just increased cardiac output and respiration. That's part of it, but it's also oxygen delivery and uptake and the mechanisms of which are, stimulated. So mechanical tension, I'm sure you guys have talked about this on the podcast, stimulates, the cascade of signals that turns on mTOR and turns on muscle protein synthesis. That is in the muscle, there's a completely different pathway that is turned on from doing aerobic training that leads to like essentially an acute energy deficit that turns on the master switch of aerobic adaptations. And that itself is what's like increasing mitochondrial biogenesis and all of those things. And so we want that. We want more mitochondria. So my take is that build muscle through lifting, condition that muscle through cardio training. That's my approach to metabolic health and fitness. We want to, and it's cyclical, right? Like you want to have muscle, but you want to have it be conditioned. You don't just want to be the meathead who can't walk up a flight of stairs. Like that isn't good. Your VO2 max also decreases with age, just like muscle does. And so we want to make ourselves resilient and robust. And that also helps stave off like a lot of the risks that come with aging from metabolic disease. Yes, muscle is an important protector of these things, but your aerobic fitness and your mitochondrial density really impacts how your body handles the food that you intake and your metabolism across the day. And it's heavily related to your metabolic health. Like there's direct ties to this. We have these studies of people who we put on bed rest and their metabolic flexibility goes down with bed rest, right? You want to be very active. You don't want to be sedentary. And ideally you're doing something that's putting stress and strain on your body enough that you're adapting cardiovascularly. So a good place to start is just meeting the exercise guidelines that 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity or 75 minutes of vigorous activity or a combination of each. That looks like probably, 1 to 2 hit sessions per week mixed with, 2 to 3 easier days, or you can kind of mix across the week. It just depends. It's kind of like a 2-for-1 trade-off. I'm personally of the opinion that moderate or easy intensity exercise isn't the same benefit as higher intensity exercise. We want both. You want that stress and that stimulus. It's like saying, lifting for a set of 3 is the same as lifting for a set of 10. Well, it's not, right? You're training kind of different characteristics of that. So you want to do the same with cardio. I love comparing cardio training and programming to lifting because I think people think cardio is just go do 30 minutes and see you later. Like there's an art and a science to cardio training, just like lifting. and where you can develop energy systems and substrate metabolism and become more efficient or think about those things just like you do with lifting. And so some of the mistakes I see people doing though with this is one, they just start slapping cardio onto their lifting and then they expect nothing to happen. And then they say cardio killed my gains or cardio didn't work for me. Well, you need to adjust to that. You got to adjust to that volume. It's novel. You need to recover. And so what you need to either do is slightly decrease your lifting volume when you're adding that cardio as your body adapts, especially if it's super new, or add it in slowly enough that you can kind of give yourself time to adapt to that over time. Increase your carbohydrate intake or calorie intake, usually from carbs. Cardio uses more carbohydrates, so you want to do that. Making sure you're sleeping enough and supporting all those things, and then giving it time. I think too many people jump to the gun and think that, oh, this is killing me gains, this doesn't work. But the reason so many of us can still lift at the same capacity of what we're doing while doing so much cardio is because we're just adapted to it. At cardio, everyone always says like, don't do cardio because you become adapted and that's what makes you fat. But that's like the benefit of cardiovascular training is you become more efficient. Like everyone says that like it's a bad thing. And it's like, no, that's good. That means that run that you're doing is less energy costly and it's more recoverable for your body and you're fitter. Like that's a good sign that you're becoming adapted to these things. It's not as stressful. That's what we want over time. That's what makes us, that's like what I want when I'm training for a race. I don't want it to be like the most exhausting, fatiguing thing I've ever done 6 months into my training block. I want it to be this more recoverable stimulus, right? But you can also progress training. Like you don't have to be like, you can increase speed or intensity or volume, just like you can with lifting. And so, I think a mistake people do too is like, yes, get it in however you want, but be intentional with it, right? You can be intentional and strategic. And also cardio doesn't need to just be this mundane grind. Like it can be fun. It can be variable. I think that, cardio is the one place that if you're just doing it for health, you can have more variability with it and it doesn't need to be as serious. And then if you have specific goals or you want a specific thing or you're lacking specific components of fitness, then maybe we are getting more dialed in specific of things, but it doesn't need to be like, you can kind of get benefit from it with it just being a little bit more random, I guess. That's not to say that there isn't specific benefits to different types of cardio and things like zone 2 versus HIIT or whatever. But if you're just doing it just to do it, then get it in, but also making sure that you're adjusting your training to account for that new volume, you're adjusting your nutrition to account for that volume, and you're giving it enough time to actually adapt to that new stimulus before you like give up or keep ramping it up or keep, grinding yourself into a hole.
I think one thing I wanted to mention on that too was you kind of mentioned like, people saying like you adapt to it. I feel like that probably comes from the mindset of, and I'm curious, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but like the mindset of cardio is there for like fat burn, like to drop body fat basically, right? I feel like that's probably where that kind of came from because in that sense, like, yeah, that's probably not great. But again, that's probably where people miss cardio training in particular.
Yeah, I think that we should stop using cardio as only a tool for fat loss. I think that that's misguided. I think it leads people to over rely on cardio to maintain their body weight, which don't get me wrong. People who have higher energy flux and higher energy output across the day get to eat a lot more and they get to manage their weight on a lot more calories and it's easier. I think people also paint the picture of like doing exercise does nothing for fat loss. Sure, but long-term weight maintainers actually have high levels of physical activity. So while it maybe isn't the best stimulus for weight loss, it is a good indication that you're going to maintain your healthy body composition or fat loss long term. It's not nothing, right? Just like when you train or increase your training volume, you do need to eat more. It's just not as much as people think. But if you're doing 30 minutes of elliptical at the same pace or intensity for all of your cardio every single day, guess what? That stimulus and that extra stress on your body, it becomes just part of your norm, right? So yeah, it's not going to keep adding more and more to your system of your body. You're going to adapt. Just like if you did the same lift and never increased your weights month after month after month, it's the same thing, right? So that's why you can go faster or you can go harder or you can go longer within those things. And so, yeah, I think that people make the mistake of only viewing cardio as a fat loss tool and they get overly reliant on it, or they're only doing it to burn calories and fat loss. And they forget that if you just improve your fitness and you do cardio with the intention of improving your fitness, you become better fat burners, better at oxidizing fat, more metabolically flexible, healthier, or you are expending more energy because you're always stressing up on some area of your cardiovascular fitness and training, right? It's not like it's like useless, but yeah, if we're doing 30 minutes of 10-minute per mile pace consistently every single, and that's it. That's all we're doing. Or honestly, quite frankly, people aren't doing enough cardio at a volume enough for it to really drive. Like I think people think that cardio, even 20, 30 minutes of it, is having this robust fat loss stimulus or response. And you're like, you need a lot more cardio probably in a week to have that than what people are thinking. And so they think, oh, I didn't, which like if you view that 20, 30 minutes of cardio as like I'm doing something good for my health or my body or my fitness, you might feel more satisfied by it than like, oh, I didn't lose any fat by adding this 30 minutes of cardio. And well, it probably wasn't ever going to move the needle forward on fat loss for you anyway, but that doesn't mean that it's not beneficial or it's not helping you. I think for women especially, you know, I think if we stop viewing fitness as only a means to change our bodies and we look at actually moving the needle forward on performance metrics, that doesn't mean you have to race or compete or do any of these things. You usually end up getting more body composition changes, more results, more progress, and it's more enjoyable. And that's not to say that I'm against you wanting to change your body or body composition. I know for a lot of people, that's why they want to exercise and train. But if you view only your workouts as a mode of expending energy, you're probably not getting the most out of them. And or you're more likely to get frustrated with that versus like, let's get better. Let's beat the logbook or, you know, move the needle forward on what we're doing instead of only viewing it as a tool for fat loss. Again, that doesn't mean you can't want to not change your body, but use your kind of external gym behaviors like nutrition and sleep and lifestyle choices to really drive that, and use the gym sessions specific to gaining muscle or improving cardiovascular fitness. And you'll end up probably getting more of what you want overall.
Yeah, it's weird. It's just that like one kind of just kind of your mindset to it, just that one kind of shift there with it. Because if anything, you know, kind of what I feel like I've learned with cardio too, and you kind of hit on all the benefits of it. It's like it almost if you focus on improving it, you know, like you said there with that, it's like it almost makes your body a little bit more receptive to body comp changes, right? Like you're kind of setting yourself up for that improvement there versus like if you go into it, like you said there, where it's like, I'm going to burn as much energy as I can. I'm going to use it just for fat loss. You almost end up not doing it. So it's like the one thing you are trying to do there with that. So like you said, kind of changing that mindset with it can be super helpful there with, you know, for somebody who, because like like we said, a lot of people that listen to this, you know, they lift weights and stuff. So like for you, what would be like, how could you translate that over to like the lifter? Like what would be some benefits of like, hey, if you do this is like going to improve your lifting as well too potentially, or do you not see that there's really any carryover from that?
So one, there's some data slowly coming out that cardio training is actually improving potentially muscle gains and hypertrophy response. That's still pretty new, but it's not shocking. You have improved blood flow and you have improved density and you have potentially improved nutrient supply to that muscle. So it's like not crazy to me that that would be happening. But two, you know, what energy system recovers you between heavy aerobic energy system, right? And so your phosphocreatine system is recovered with the aerobic system. And so you will recover probably faster between sets. And you might even be able to handle more volume in the gym because you might not be, you know, your cardiovascular capacity shouldn't be limiting factor in your weightlifting, right? Like that is, if you're getting winded from your lifting sets, like that's not a good sign. Like you know, you're going to have high blood pressure and that brace in breathing from the Valsalva and lifting hard and exertion. Like that's normal. That should happen. But if you're being winded and to the point that your sets feel like cardio, not just muscular fatigue and exhaustion, you know, that might give you the indication like, hey, I would recover faster and easier, not only between these sets in the gym, but also week to week, you know, day to day. You have increased blood flow. And, you know, that's like great for like, you know, I hate the term active recovery, but it kind of is, you know, helping recover that. You're bringing blood flow and nutrients and clearing out debris in the muscle tissue and things like that. And so, you know, also the most fit, healthy people are fit and healthy, right? Like being a lifter with the VO2 max of a 80-year-old isn't a bragging right? Like saying like, oh, I only run cardio, I would never be caught running unless I'm getting chased isn't bragging, right? You like having poor fitness. If you're going to emulate health and you're going to emulate fitness to your kids or your spouse or your clients or your peers, like you should be doing cardio. And what I find the most funny and interesting about all of this cardio hate, cardio kills your gains, which I think the industry is finally kind of like coming around to it, because we're seeing, honestly, it's very unfortunate, but only jack dudes have been able to move this needle forward. I'm like, here I am the whole time doing all this, but trying to spread the good news. But, you know, when we think about it, what do bodybuilders do? They do a shit ton of cardio when they're cutting or prepping. And I'm like, okay, why is you doing 60 minutes of the stair stepper or incline walking any different than me training my 60-minute stair stepper or incline walking for my ultra? Why is that any different? It isn't. It's just because you're using it as an energy deficit driver and a fat loss tool. But that's, I mean, obviously people are in an energy deficit then and they're intentionally trying to shred and cut weight when they're doing that. But like those people, yes, they're going to lose some muscle in the process of that cut for that show or whatever they're doing because they're in an energy deficit and or potentially from excess cardio as part of that, right? Underfed cardio is going to have that impact on things. But I'm like, how is this any different, right? This is no different. Doing your little booty band stair stepping workout isn't magically more muscle protective than my 30 minutes of stair stepping that I do training for a race. It's just people's mindset and thought and approach around what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so, I think people undervalue the benefit for health, and health is supporting your performance. And you don't need to train for an ultra to be healthy and support your lifting or your recovery. Like, and if you're worried about those things, do it on a bike, do it on a rower, because running might be more fatiguing and it might impact your lifting, or you're not doing enough for the volume of it to really even matter. Or it might actually help your performance. Like being well-rounded in your performance and your health is actually a good thing. It's that general physical preparedness that we want for all things in life and fitness. And I think sometimes the bodybuilding side of the industry has really kind of lost that multidimensional components of fitness and jumping and sprinting and moving. And your cardio doesn't, again, you don't have to be this super long endurance runner, but people think that you're going to look like a lead pack marathoner if you start doing cardio. And you're probably just going to look like a better body comp version of your current self, right? Like that's probably the reality of what's actually going to happen. And I say this as someone who's maintained relatively the same amount of lean mass as quantified by DEXA for the last I did lose muscle when I first started ultra training because I didn't know how to lift and run concurrently, and I gave up lifting too much. But that's because I pulled back the lifting, right? And I was training for ultra marathons,
Yeah.
but I put a ton back on. And since then, I've maintained it relatively consistently by just eating enough to support that on top of what I'm doing. And it just doesn't milk you away in the same way people think that it does, but you kind of have to show yourself that to believe it, right? Like people sometimes just need to, it's like your clients who don't think that if they take a week off on vacation, they're going to lose all their muscle, but that they're not, but they have to see that won't happen before they trust and believe it. Yeah.
It's funny as you said that where people think if they start doing cardio, they're just going to lose all their muscle. It's kind of very similar to the person that doesn't want to lift weights because they feel like, hey, if they touch a weight, they're going to all of a sudden be this big bulky bodybuilder. And it's kind of funny how you'll say that, but then it's the same
and
thing.
Everyone's like, oh, I wish I was good and bulky. Yeah, I wish running made me freaking shredded doing it, right? I wish that's what happened, but it's not. That's such a good parallel. That's such a good point because it's the same exact thing in reverse.
It's funny though. I mean, everything you're saying is totally true because I definitely fell into that. Like I have a lifting background and kind of more bodybuilding ish background, aesthetics, stuff like that. And for me, for the longest time, it was like I even got so far in my phases where I was trying to gain muscle. I was not even really doing a lot of steps, honestly. I was like, I just got to make sure everything's just towards lifting weights. Otherwise I'm not going to build as much muscle. And, obviously looking back, that was a huge mistake. And I started to incorporate more cardio probably in about July. And man, it's just been super helpful. It's just been so nice to add it in. I play hockey once a week and I can just see a major difference, by just doing that. And like you said, recovery is just way better. I just feel better overall. And I feel really good after doing it too, right? That's other big things. Kind of high after.
I mean, anecdotally, I've been full blown power lifter, and I've had VO2 max tests for years and years. And I've had my VO2 max drop down to 40. And I've had my VO2 max be in the 50s up to 60. And I'm telling you right now, as a person, cognitively, physically, recovery, emotionally, I feel better when I have a decent amount of cardio and my cardio fitness is higher, not only in my training, but also in my life. And I think it's hard for people to see that and to start adding that cardio in. And you're like, oh, because there's tons of cognitive benefits, mental health benefits that come from lifting, but also cardio too. And I think that people undervalue too, also you don't realize how poor cardiovascular fitness makes you feel until you have higher cardiovascular fitness. And it doesn't need to be a ton to really get up there, right? But you feel monumentally better. I remember being a powerlifter and I felt I was not doing really any cardio, probably like you were with lifting. And I felt like everything hurt. I felt swollen. I felt gross. I felt lethargic. I just felt like I gained weight so much easier. And this is all their anecdote. So it's just me to sympathize with your lifters in the audience. I deadlifted 400 pounds. I was 153 pounds and I had a VO2 max of 40 and I felt terrible. But last year when I deadlifted 365 pounds, not that much far off that PR, training for ultras, running 35 miles a week, I felt way better and I was 10 pounds lighter. So it's like that felt healthier and better to me. And my performance really is similar to what it was even like 2 years before when I pulled that same lifting number with the same amount of muscle mass, but I was technically leaner, which we're all wanting, right? And like I didn't just melt away into nothing because I kept training hard while adapting to that cardio. That's the key. You have to keep lifting and you have to keep eating to support it, in order to kind of like allow both of those things to kind of support you at the same time.
Yeah, real quick, last question I have for you before I let you go. What are some signs that like your cardio training is working? Like what again, I know we kind of talked about some maybe subjective feelings there with that in terms of how you feel, but what are some things that you like to monitor and track there with that?
So things that I think people underrate, your resting heart rate will drop, your heart rate variability will go up if you use the fitness trackers, your blood pressure will go down, your blood panel numbers will improve. Like these are the health markers I think people underestimate to think, because cardio adaptations take a really long time. We're talking like 1 to 2 years for like really robust adaptations to happen, or it takes a lot of volume. That doesn't mean you won't see things in 6, 8, 12 weeks. You will, but it does take like quite a bit of time. Like think about how slow it is to build muscle. That's probably just about as slow as it is to build cardio adaptations. I think people think it's going to be instantaneous because you might, but you just need your body to have the time to develop literally new tissues, just like with lifting. But otherwise, when you're looking performance metrics, so you can think either you're doing the same intensity, pace, effort at a lower heart rate, so your heart rate is dropping at the same relative pace and intensity, or the opposite, you can go faster or harder or do more total work at the same relative heart rate. So there usually are two indications that something's moving forward. You're either, at the same relative physiological effort, you can do more work, or the same amount of work is less fatiguing physiologically on your system. So those are usually good indications that your cardio is working, or you can do more. You can go for longer. You can handle more in the week. It's just like lifting, right? What you can handle as a trained lifter is a lot different than a beginner can handle, right? That overall capacity for how much volume you can handle is very different. So it's similar with that. Or you can tolerate higher intensities for longer and or recover with less recovery needed between like intervals, or your heart rate drops faster between intervals. Things like that are what I usually look for with these types of things, or like, because that's usually an indication that your aerobic system is becoming more developed. Call it the drop. You know how people call it the drop when you like are dieting and all of a sudden you like the whoosh is what they
The
call
whoosh,
it.
yeah.
I call it the gulp or the drop. Like it's your mitochondria suddenly start using oxygen, and it's like I'll go out for a run and all of a sudden I'm faster or my heart rate's a lot lower, and I'm like, ooh, we got fitter. And it kind of just happens. It's like very, very slow. And then suddenly, and then I'm like, okay, I got another 2 months until this happens again. Right. Like, but look for those little indications. Like if I'm doing a speed work session, like I'm going to do this afternoon, if those intervals start going, I'm able to go faster, or they feel more controlled, or my heart rate is lower during them at the same pace and intensity, that's how I know I'm getting fitter. And that's what I'm looking for. And it doesn't have to be running. It applies the air bike, the rower, all the same thing, pace, intensity, power, output, mode, whatever it is. And looking for those kind of little indications. And don't get beat up if it doesn't happen every single week, because it's not gonna, it's like the overhead press equivalent, right? Like it's not gonna get better every single week. It's gonna take a long time before you start to feel you can go faster or harder at these paces and intensities.
Yeah, because I would imagine, probably your recovery and, kind of what you're doing in that short term probably is going to impact, how you feel, from time to time. So again, so long as like overall over time it's trending in the right direction, you're in a good spot there. Cool. So appreciate your time. I guess two things. One, when is your race? And then two, where can the audience find you if they want to learn more?
Yeah, I hopefully I'm running a 50K for like a fun tune-up race next month. And then my 100 miler, who
Crazy.
knows what I'll get in between all these things, is in October.
Cool.
I'm doing it with my buddy Jason, who I did my 100K with, and he's like he's a doctor resident, like super strong bro. So we're joking we're training to have the biggest biceps at the ultra. That's our joke.
No.
That's in October, and I'm really excited about that.
Awesome.
And then yeah, everyone can find me pretty much. Dockless Fitness on Instagram is where I would like my most hang out. Docklessfitness.com. I also have a YouTube, Dockless Fitness, and my podcast, The Messy Middle. And I have a lot more stuff on female phys and cardio and hybrid training. That's kind of like the three things that I'm most known for. And so this was a very shallow view of all that stuff. So if you're like, oh, I want more about these individual topics, go to my YouTube and just like binge my videos. There's more coming on all these things. Or I have an ebook called Hybrid or a Zones mini guide. And those will be really helpful for like programming or approaching either cardio or combining that with it. If you want to drink the hybrid training Kool-Aid, you're sick of just being a beefcake and you want to feel like an athlete again, that's what we do, or I do, and my team. So That's my sales point there. But we have a lot of really helpful stuff. We, as in me, my team edits and just points things out. I say we because it's not just a me effort. But yeah, I have a lot of content to learn further if you want to learn more.
Cool. Yeah, no, awesome. Yeah, like you said, there's only so much you can talk about in an hour. I wanted to talk to you about hybrid training. We didn't get into that, but I feel like the cardio was a good thing for, my audience to talk about to make it,
You
to
gotta
kind of
start
blend
doing
that.
cardio before you
Yeah.
can. It's kind of like the menstrual cycle pyramid. You have to develop the aerobic base and the strength base before you can start building and stacking up.
Yep. I know you have some really good content on that. So,
Yeah.
Alyssa, really appreciate your time. Obviously, hopefully we can get you on again in the future at some point, to chat a little bit more, but yeah, appreciate your time and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.